All right, good evening. You might get your Bibles and turn to Leviticus 8. Leviticus 8 is where we're going to start tonight. Well, that's where we're going to spend probably a good chunk of our time. And so good to see you and glad that we have this opportunity to study together. As we talked about last time, as we open up the book of Leviticus, we are at Mount Sinai. And according to Wikipedia, this is a picture of Mount Sinai. And so there is, that's the highest peak. It's kind of a rocky mountain range, but that's the highest peak. And potentially where Moses went up on the mountain. And when we look at the book of Leviticus and the first 10 chapters of, the middle of Exodus, from Exodus 19, all the way to through the book of Leviticus, and the first 10 chapters of the book of Numbers were all at Mount Sinai. So it's a huge chunk of material just sitting in one spot. And that's because this is where the law is being given. And I do want to take just a minute, and I'm not going to try to dominate tonight, but I would like to just kind of survey a timeline up to how we got to this moment right here. Most of this you've already talked about. So on the 15th day of the first month of the first year, by our reckoning, it would be something like the year 1446 BC. But they left Egypt. And that's what God called the first month of the first year was when they left Egypt. Kind of year one is them leaving Egypt. On the 15th day, they left Egypt. It took them 1 month to make it into the wilderness of Sin. I know it sounds like a terrible place to be, but it really was just the word sin. Didn't have anything to do with transgression, I don't think, particularly. And then in the third month of the first year, they made it to Mount Sinai. Now, after that, after a few days, we have Exodus 20 through 24. That's the giving of the Ten Commandments, the Book of the Covenant, the ratification. You remember all the times where they said, we will obey the law. They're sprinkled with the blood in chapter 24. All that happens after a few days there at Mount Sinai. Then Moses goes into the mountain for 40 days. And he's receiving during that time the details of the tabernacle and the priestly service and all of that. What happens at the end of that 40 days? You remember? What event happens at the end of that 40 days?
The golden calf.
The golden calf. That's exactly right. So at the end of the 40 days, we have Exodus 32 through 34, where Moses comes down, he throws the tablets down, they've built a golden calf, violating the commandments, and then God appears and remakes the covenant with them, and they again agree to follow, even though they had not so far. Now Moses will go into the mountain for 40 more days, 40 more nights. And then following that, over the next 6 months, they will be preparing the tabernacle. They will be getting the priestly robes ready. They will be making the furnishings. So that's going to take about a 6-month process. On the first day of the first month of the second year. So we've been at Sinai. We've left Egypt about a year ago. Now on the first day of the first month of the second year, that's when they set up the tabernacle. And basically, that's when the book of Leviticus is being given to the people. That's when God is revealing to Moses all of the instructions about the sacrifices and the purity laws and things like that right here. So I think it's Leviticus 1 verse 1 talks about this happening on the first day of the first month of year 2. All right? Then what we're going to talk about tonight is Aaron and his sons are going to be consecrated over a period of 7 days. What we'll talk about next time is that first day of priestly work. And we're also going to talk about tonight the tribal princes bringing their gifts. That's going to happen in the first month through the first 12 days. All of this is going to take place. Something else happens here. We'll talk about this next week. But Nadab and Abihu have their first official day on the job, and it does not go well. So, spoiler alert. Now, on the first day of the second month, the second year, the census and the organization begin. Let me just mention this so that it's not confusing to you. This right here is Numbers 7. This right here is Numbers 1 through 6. So I know that seems a little bit confusing, that why would we have Numbers 7? But chronologically, this happens while the priests are being consecrated and while that priestly service is beginning. But then the census and all that will take place after that's completed. Then we'll have what we know as the little Passover. We'll talk about that more later. And then the time to leave Sinai will be the second month of the second year. 20th day, second month of the second year. So we spend just right at a year at Sinai, right? So we got to Sinai on the third month of the first year, and we're going to be, what's that, 10 days short of a year spent at Sinai, and that includes all these events and all the preparation. And then on the 20th day of the second month of the second year, the cloud will rise up over the tabernacle and move forward, and the people will begin to follow. So that's a lot that has to happen at Sinai, but we'll talk about that as we go. And as I made mention, these are the two things that we're going to be talking about tonight, and this is what we'll talk about on Wednesday night that's coming. Okay, so now we're ready for Leviticus chapter 8, which is where we get this about Aaron and his sons are consecrated. Because you've already talked about all of this, right, as you talk about the end of the book of Exodus. All right, Mr. Dwight?
We've actually already talked about the consecration process too, but it's in the outline, so we're going to talk about it again. Look in chapter 8, and I'll read the first 5 verses. And the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, Take Aaron and his sons with him, and the garments, the anointing oil, a bull as the sin offering, 2 rams, and a basket of unleavened bread, and gather all the congregation together at the door of the tabernacle of meeting. So Moses did as the Lord commanded him, and the congregation was gathered together at the door of the tabernacle of meeting. And Moses said to the congregation, This is what the Lord commanded to be done. And so what we see here is Moses, he's getting the instructions from God, and he asked him to take Aaron and his sons to a certain place, and tells him what he needs to carry to that place, and the things that he needs when he goes there. And it says, gather all the congregation together at the door of the tabernacle of meeting. I think we discussed that a little bit too. What did we decide? Or did we decide, we're not sure exactly what this means, but if all the congregation were together to see this, what do you think it means? Well, the actual door of the tabernacle was in the courtyard, right? And there was a tent around it. There was a wall around it. So all the congregation could not probably see it. It could get in the courtyard. We know that. And so we can just assume, I think, that that's the door of the courtyard, the front door of the courtyard.
So that all the people could gather around that courtyard.
Yes.
Yeah,
mm-hmm.
That's right.
And why was it important for all the people to see this?
It is important that you guide spiritual things, I guess.
Well, they needed to see that God had changed things up. Previously to this, the offerings were offered by the heads of the families. And now things are going to change. There's a special group of men that are going to take care of this. And they're being chosen to do that, and they need to know that. And so that's why it's so important that they all see this. And it says that God, he called all of the congregation together, and here we are at the door of the tabernacle of meeting, and then Moses is going to do some things. If you'll take over there and read.
Yeah. Let me make mention of this in verse 4 and in verse 5. Where's Moses getting this information? This is what God commanded. This is what the Lord commanded. I think it's 11 times just in this chapter that Moses mentions something regarding the fact that this is what the Lord commanded. We saw that at the end of the book of Exodus, right, with discussing the building of the tabernacle. And the emphasis of that is Moses is doing everything precisely as God instructed him to do, which is exactly the right way to go about things. As we see, when people don't do it precisely the way God instructs, things go terribly. And in this case, we're going to see in a couple of instances where when they do it in the way that God prescribed, things are well, things are good. And so it's teaching us a lesson. The law is a tutor for us. It's instructive for us. That when God gives instructions, He's not just giving them for His health. He's giving them for ours. And so we need to pay attention to that instruction there. This is what the Lord commanded to be done. So picking up in verse 6, I'm going to read through. Yeah, go ahead.
So I maybe should be very confused here. So
Yeah.
it says the tent meeting, tabernacle meeting.
Yeah.
Is that the tabernacle, or is it because in Exodus 33 it talks about the tent of meeting, and I thought that was different from tabernacle. You're saying
Yes, I do understand what you're saying.
but
I would take this to be the tabernacle. Yeah. I see the issue. I think by the time we get to this, the tabernacle's been set up for about a week. Well, actually, on the day that the tabernacle is set up, they start this process, and that continues for about a week.
so this has just become a new tabernacle meeting.
Yeah. I'm sorry. I'm not. That is not as familiar on my mind because I didn't go through Exodus with you guys. I should have watched the Facebook Live. But in my thinking, this is the tabernacle itself having been set up before.
Which makes sense. That makes it mentions.
So before the tabernacle, there was a place where Moses went and met with the Lord.
And it says like that one was outside the camp.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I just did this similar phrase.
Right. I see what you're saying. Okay. It's a good question. In verse 6, and looking at I'm going to look through verse 9 to begin with. Moses brought Aaron and his sons and washed them with water. And he put the coat on him, and tied the sash around his waist, and clothed him with a robe, and put the ephod on him, and tied the skillfully woven band of the ephod around him, binding it to him with the band. And he placed the breastpiece on him. In the breastpiece he put the Urim and the Thummim, and he set the turban on his head, and on the turban in the front he set the golden plate, the holy crown, as the Lord commanded Moses. Let's go ahead and read through verse 13. Then Moses took the anointing oil and anointed the tabernacle and all that was in it, and consecrated them, and he sprinkled some of it on the altar 7 times, and anointed the altar and all its utensils and the basin and its stand to consecrate them. And he poured some of the anointing oil on Aaron's head and anointed him to consecrate him. And Moses brought Aaron's sons and clothed them with the coats and tied sashes around their waists and bound caps on them, as the Lord commanded Moses. So what's happening to Aaron and then to his sons in this setting here? They're being anointed. That might be the key event that's happening here. They're washed, I think signifying a cleansing as they go into this work. They are clothed with this priestly robes. I think as Brother Dwight mentioned earlier, this is to distinguish them, right? Not just anybody could serve in this role. Not just anybody could wear these clothes. This is a unique and specific role that Aaron and his descendants are going to play. And then you have the sons who are going to be clothed and anointed as well. Brother Waldner made the point in his book that probably only Aaron has the oil poured over his head at this time. That the sons would have been anointed in some way, but not have had the oil poured over their head like Aaron did. And that may come up more later. But the reason that that's important is because the high priest is specifically mentioned as the one who had the oil poured over his head. So he's going to serve as the high priest, which is the chief executor of the sacrifices and the things like that. So you kind of got a hierarchy, right? You've got the high priest, then you have priests, and then you have Levites. And I have a chart on that I'll bring next time. I don't have it tonight. But anyway, and then all of the materials are going to be consecrated. This idea of consecrated, what do we mean when we use the word consecrated? Set apart, right. It's closely related. I don't know why, but in English we don't really have a set of words. But basically, as I understand it, in the Hebrew, holy, sanctified, consecrate, all of that is in the same family of words. So we don't see that as clearly in our translations. We could, right? You could say these things are holy because they've been holified, right? And God holified them, right? That would be kind of the way that we would use that word. So consecrate is like the verb form of to make something holy. And so Brother Gerald said to set apart, and that's right. But it's not just to set apart and separate it, it's to set apart for special use. And that is the distinguishing of holiness from just something that's distinguished or separated. When it's made holy, it's set apart for special purposes. You don't use this stuff for just anything. It's for God's purposes. It's for God's work that this stuff is going to be used. All right. Anything else through verse 13?
This idea of being washed is an idea that's also carried over today in the Christian dispensation. How are we washed today? Through baptism, right? Hebrews 10:22 says, "Let us draw near with a true heart and full assurance of faith, having our hearts sprinkled from an evil conscience and our bodies washed with pure water." And so we're washed today too. It's not a literal washing, but like they were, but what was done to them. But it's through baptism that we're washed today also. They put on the robes, and what do we put on today? We put something on ourselves, Christ, right? As many as have been baptized have put on Christ today. I just wanted to mention that.
That's great. Anything you guys want to say? You guys, y'all. All right. Dwight, you want to take us through 14 and follow?
Where did you leave off?
I left off at 13, I believe.
And he brought the bull for the sin offering. Then Aaron and his sons laid their hands on the head of the bull for the sin offering. And Moses killed it. Then he took the blood and put some on the horns of the altar all around with his finger and purified the altar. And he poured the blood at the base of the altar and consecrated it to make atonement for it. Then he took all the fat that was on the entrails, the fatty lobe attached to the liver, and the 2 kidneys with their fat, and Moses burned them on the altar. But the bull, its hide, its flesh, and its offal, he burned with fire outside the camp, as the Lord had commanded Moses. So here we see that he uses a bull as a sin offering here, and it says that now Moses is the one that did the killing here, because he's officiating for the first 7 days. And they laid their hands on the head of the bull and Moses killed it, it says. And so it tells what they did with this bull, all the different things they flayed this bull, I guess you might say. And it seems strange to me. They at the very end there, it says they burned them on the altar. They took the fat and the entrails and the 2 kidneys, and they burned them on the altar. What did they do with the blood?
I think they put it on.
Yeah.
Yes, they took a small amount and consecrated the altar, and they poured the rest of it out at the base. So the majority of the blood would be poured out at the base of the altar. That's pretty much what that says there. Does anybody have any comments on that?
The rest of it they took out. It wasn't used for anything.
Yeah. Yeah. So when we survey, so it'll be a couple of classes from now, but when we survey like chapters 1 through 7, we'll get more details about what these sacrifices look like. But basically, I think the sin offering, the representation here is that you have part of it offered to God, but then some of it's taken outside, taken away, right? And maybe pictures what God is doing with the sin, taking it outside the camp, and it's being burned up completely outside the camp. And if I understand correctly, the things in verse 16, the fat, the liver, the kidneys, this would be like, not the choicest parts necessarily to eat, but it would be like the things most at the center of this animal. And so those things are being offered up to God. And then kind of the parts that would not be, the parts that would be maybe like the leftover is taken and it's burned outside the camp. And I do want to make the point, I think that when he puts the blood on the horns of the altar, maybe that's the altar of incense, and then pours the rest of it at the base of the altar of burnt offering, so that both the altar of incense inside the tent is being consecrated and the altar of burnt offering is being consecrated as well. So it just calls both of them the altar, but I think that's probably what's
I agree with that.
Yeah.
Seems like
maybe we're talking about two altars there. One consecrated at the beginning of verse 16, and then the blood poured out the base of the burnt offering. And you might say, well, why does all of this matter? Well, it matters because all of this is a picture of what God, the Hebrew writer will make the point that with the blood, there comes remission of sins. And just think about the amount of blood that is involved in this whole process. And he's teaching these people a lesson. He's teaching us a lesson as we read through this about the centrality of blood to life, to holiness, to communion with God, and all of that. Somebody said that if you wrung your Old Testament, it would just drip with blood. And that's especially true of the book of Leviticus, isn't it? You could just wring it out and blood would drip. Because there's so much of that. And what we're learning about is how to come in the presence of a holy God. And the very first step in that process is there's a lot of blood, right? And it's a lot of blood because just a little blood wouldn't make the point. It's pointing forward to the fact that even this much blood is not enough. Because they're repeating this process for 7 days. And then they're going to have to do it on the regular for a long, long time. And somebody's going to begin to think, is there a better way than all this blood? Yeah, there's a better way. And the Hebrew writer will make that point when we come to that.
We better be glad we were in the better way.
That's right.
Yeah.
That's right.
Yeah, one thing is atonement required the shedding of blood, and it does today too, right? Christ's blood is what atones us today. I've often wondered where this outside the camp area would be. You know, that had to be a big camp, right?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, had to take it a long way. And let me make just one point about that. And I think we'll come back to this when we talk about the sin offering and try to get some more of the details of that. But in Hebrews 13, talks about the fact that Jesus, our sin offering, has been offered outside the camp. They took him outside the city in order to offer him as a sacrifice. And basically the point that the Hebrew writer makes is that all along, God was teaching us that our sin offering had to be taken outside the camp. Jesus was taken outside the camp. And he says, let us go to him outside the camp. So I think the problem with the Hebrew Christians was that they were afraid of being cut off from the life of the Jewish people. They were being afraid of being cut off from the temple and from the social life of the Jewish people. And the Hebrew writer makes the point is, our sin offering has always been outside the camp. And Jesus was taken outside the camp. And it is no shame to be taken outside the camp if that's where we're going to be in touch with our sin offering. And so he says, let's follow him, right? If Jesus was cut off, if he was sent outside away from his people, then it's an honor for us to be able to go outside the camp too. Even if that means losing the connections with the Jewish people. For us, even if that means losing connections with our family, to be able to pursue our sin offering. And he says, because here we have no lasting city, right? It's okay to go outside the camp because the camp here is not going to last forever anyway. So we can be connected to the thing that is going to last forever, which is our sin offering, our sacrifice. So I think that takes us down to what, verse 17? Did you leave off there?
18.
Oh, verse 18. Anybody else have anything?
There's something to the fact that the things they took out some all seem to be useful things.
Mm.
So you have the skin, flesh, and dung.
Yeah.
Like, all those have purposes, different purposes. They all could be useful in some way. It's like we're not going to use those for anything.
Yeah. That's interesting. I don't know. Yeah, perhaps. I agree that they are useful and that they are the things that are taken aside. So, when we talk about our heart, like we think of, sometimes people say follow your heart or whatever, and they talk about that as the internal, like where they get their direction from. Well, they would have said your guts. are your bowels, right? So you know, in the old King James, Paul would talk about the bowels of mercy, right? That would be the word they would use instead of hearts. They looked at the liver and the kidneys and the intestines as like, you get a gut feeling, right? It's just the center and the seat of your emotion. And that's the thing that's being offered to God. That's the heart, and not literally the heart, but the seat, the center thing is being offered to God, and then the rest of it's taken out and offered. So there may be a connection there as well. But that's a good point. All right, so verse 18 and following. So we've looked at the bull for the sin offering. Now remember, we'll make this point again. We'll reiterate it because God reiterates it several times. Who is this sin offering being made for here? I think it's for the priests, right? That was a shortcoming of that priesthood, that they had to have a sin offering. Now, any one of us would have had to have a sin offering in order to serve as a priest. But that's why we needed a better priesthood. All right, and then there's going to be a ram for the burnt offering. And if I understand correctly, the sin offering takes care of sin, but the burnt offering is a picture of complete devotion to God. And so not only the priest would offer one, but it would be particularly appropriate for the priest to offer a burnt offering of devotion to God. So this takes us to verse 18. He presented the ram of the burnt offering, and Aaron and his sons laid their hands on the head of the ram, and he killed it, and Moses threw the blood against the sides of the altar. He cut the ram into pieces, and Moses burned the head and the pieces and the fat. He washed the entrails and the legs with water, and Moses burned the whole ram on the altar. It was a burnt offering with a pleasing aroma, a food offering for the Lord, as the Lord commanded Moses. The burnt offering, as far as I can tell, no part of it was eaten by the priest. Some of the other offerings, the priest would eat a part of it, the worshiper would eat a part of it. But this, the whole thing is burned up to God, completely devoted to God. And I think that's the picture that it's painting. The sin offering taken outside the camp. The burnt offering completely offered on the altar to God. I beseech you, as by the mercy of God, that you present your bodies as living sacrifices, wholly acceptable to God, Paul says in Romans 12. The burnt offering was a picture of their lives being offered in dedication to God. And I think they were supposed to get the picture. I don't know that they always did, but I think they were supposed to be learning from these things. And we certainly are supposed to be learning from these things as we see them in the New Covenant. Anything through verse 21?
No, one thing I thought about, God has his own ways about how things should be done. And a lot of things don't make sense. You know, a lot of this wouldn't make much sense to us, but should we question it? We shouldn't question what God says, right? We should just have enough faith to obey him and just do what he says. And he's very meticulous too. And we'll see later on, especially, that if you did not follow the commands of God precisely, then you would be killed or bad consequences from it.
So washing the ankles, that would be symbolic of being clean already, as far as you devote yourself.
Yeah.
The sin offering has already been offered, so that.
Yeah, maybe. I think part of this is like everything, the things that are offered to God are purified in some way before they're even offered. So I think that's a great point. Y'all talked about the tabernacle in the last quarter. Before you even come into the courtyard, right? The first thing you do is you're washing in that laver, because the washing has to take place before you can even offer the sacrifices. And it's almost even as if the offerings themselves have to be washed before they can be offered. And all of this is a picture of Jesus, right? He's the priest, he's the tabernacle, he's the offering itself. But I think it's a picture of us too in some ways, right? We're offering ourselves, so we're washed first and then we're offered on the altar. The things that we offer to God are offerings as well. They should be pure as we offer them. But I think that's a great point to not only the blood, but the washing. It's almost as if those things go right together. I think we're ready for verse 22. You want to take us through?
Okay, this is for the consecration process, actually. And he brought the second ram, the ram of consecration. Then Aaron and his sons laid their hands on the head of the ram, and Moses killed it. Also, he took some of its blood and put it on the tip of Aaron's right ear, on the thumb of his right hand, and on the big toe of his right foot. Then he brought Aaron's sons, and Moses put some of the blood on the tips of their right ears, on the thumbs of their right hands, and on the big toes of their right feet. And Moses sprinkled the blood all around on the altar. And then he took the fat and the fat tail, all the fat that was on the entrails, the fatty lobe attached to the liver, the two kidneys and their fat, and the right thigh. And from the basket of unleavened bread that was before the Lord, he took one unleavened cake of bread, anointed it with oil, and one wafer, and put them on the fat on the right thigh. And then he put all these in Aaron's hands and in his son's hands, and waved them as a wave offering before the Lord. So remember I said this is, you know, an unusual thing, putting blood on the tips of their these right ear, the right thumb, and the big toe on his right foot. That doesn't make a lot of sense, does it? It doesn't really matter if it makes sense or not, does it? But that's what he did. And of course, this is for the consecration of Aaron and his sons here, the ram of consecration. And it just basically he did. He took some from the basket of unleavened bread, one unleavened cake of bread, anointed it with oil, and he put all these in Aaron's hands, and he offered it as a wave offering. Now, this is something different. A wave offering, don't know a whole lot about it, but it kind of like we talked about the other day. It was he might have just heaved it up to the Lord, but it's just a show of appreciation, I think, for what God has given them. And this was belonged to them as their part, right? Is that correct?
Yes, I think typically they would have eaten this.
Yes, typically.
But I think maybe in this
case, they don't.
Now, so it looks to me like, let's see, Brother Waldron is very helpful on this. If you've got his little book, it's a pretty big book, but if you've got this book is very helpful. And so basically, I think the way he describes it is this was what a typical peace offering would have been, but it's offered in conjunction with that burnt offering. And normally the priest, maybe the offerer in general, would have eaten part of this, because I think the peace offering was supposed to be about reconciliation between God and the person. But in this case, it's all offered to God. And like you said, we don't know all the purposes that are behind this, but I think there's a lot of symbolism in the ear, the thumb, and the foot being dedicated, consecrated to God. I'm not going to be listening to other folks. My ear is set apart for him. My hands, especially the priest, his hands are set apart for God's work. His feet are set apart for God's work. And so maybe you would say, well, I'd have put it on his heart, or I'd have put it on, well, that doesn't matter. It doesn't matter what you. God says, I want your ear, I want your hand, and I want your foot to be specifically pointed out as in my service. And if our ear is listening, and our hands are doing, and our feet are going where God wants us to go, then we're in pretty good shape. And I think the idea there is setting the priest. That's what this sacrifice is about, the ordination. And I think the word ordination is literally the idea of filling up the hands, entrusting this, putting it in your hands. So we use the word ordination to, like, when we appoint somebody to a task, they are ordained. This is, their hands are being filled. The task is being put into their hands. And that's what's happening here. This is when really the responsibility is being transferred from the fathers, and then it went to Moses, and now it's being handed over into the hands of these priests. And so it's so important that they be ear, hand, and foot dedicated to God in this. And obviously, as Mr. Dwight said at the end of verse 29, as the Lord commanded Moses. This is repeating that instruction that God is the one who's giving these instructions. That statement about that. All right, let's look at verse 30, and why don't we just read through the end of the chapter, if that's all right with you guys. So then Moses took some of the anointing oil and some of the blood that was on the altar and sprinkled it on Aaron and on his garments, and also on his sons and his sons' garments. So he consecrated Aaron and his garments and his sons' garments with him. And Moses said to Aaron and his sons, boil the flesh at the entrance of the tent of meeting, and there eat it, and the bread that is in the basket of ordination offerings, as I commanded, saying, Aaron and his sons shall eat it. And what remains of the flesh and the bread you shall burn up with fire. And you shall not go outside the entrance of the tent of meeting for 7 days, until the days of your ordination are completed, for it will take 7 days to ordain you. As has been done today, the Lord has commanded to make atonement for you at the entrance of the tent of meeting You shall remain day and night for 7 days, performing what the Lord has charged, so that you do not die. For so I have been commanded. And Aaron and his sons did all the things that the Lord commanded by Moses. So how long is this process going to be repeated? 7 days. 7 days. And notice in verse 34, as Lord commanded, to be done to make atonement for you. Atonement is one of those really good and important Bible words that just shows up all the way through. And literally the word is to cover. Really, the word atonement is kind of a made-up English word to try to summarize what's being said by this word atonement. So when Noah covered the ark with pitch, he atoned it. He kapar, I think is something like the Hebrew word. I don't know. But anyway, so it's covered. But it's not the sense that like when I sweep at the house, I just sweep it under the rug. Right? That's not the covering here. It is like when you pay the debt. Right? I've covered it. It's taken care of. So these sacrifices would be the means by which God covers, not sweeps under the rugs, but takes care of the debt or the sin that has been committed. And here it's being done for the priests. And there is a part of this that they are eating, and maybe that's connected to that peace offering back up earlier in the chapter, but perhaps this is something different. But anyway, so this is going to be repeated for 7 days in order to kind of initiate the priest into the service. Anything else about all that?
Over in Exodus 29, it says that you shall offer a bull every day as a sin offering for atonement. So like he said, it was going to be done every day for 7 days.
And Mr. Dwight may mention this earlier, but Hebrews 10 picks up on this idea of sprinkling them with the water, with the blood. So this is Hebrews 10:22. Let us draw near with a sincere heart in full assurance of faith, having our hearts sprinkled clean from an evil conscience and our bodies washed with pure water. So you can see how the Hebrew writer is picking up on the language of the book of Leviticus. Somebody says, why do we study the book of Leviticus? Well, I think the Hebrew writer just assumes that we know what's going on in the book of Leviticus. And why were they being sprinkled with pure water? What's happening here? Why were they being sprinkled with the blood in this case? That's verse 30. The blood that's being sprinkled on Aaron and his garments and his sons and his sons' garments. Why is that happening? What does it represent here? The cleansing. I think that's right. Cleansing and dedication to the task. Sanctifying, setting them apart. Well, we've been sprinkled. Not with blood and bulls and goats, but with Christ's blood. And our bodies have been washed with pure water. I think a reference to baptism. And that all kind of happens at the same time. When we're buried in the water, it's not the water that's making us clean. It's the blood of Christ that's being sprinkled on our hearts that makes us clean. But it happens as our bodies are being washed with water. And all of that is a picture of our sanctification, of our dedication to God as we make the transition from a life of sin to a life of following Christ. Anything else through chapter 8?
No.
Anything else from y'all about chapter 8?
So were they confined to the courtyard for 7 days or the actual tabernacle?
I think probably the courtyard, maybe at the entrance of the tent of meeting. So I should have a picture of the tabernacle that I should just reference, but I don't. So a big square, and then a smaller square in the middle. I think they're probably in the courtyard at the door of the tabernacle before they go in. I think that's probably where they're just staying. I don't know how that worked. I don't know if they took sleeping bags or what, but they're just there.
One of the notes that we had from last time we did it was this was to be done until Christ came again.
Right.
But of course they weren't. A lot of this was lost. I'm sure.
Yeah. Yeah, right. So eventually the tabernacle will be replaced by the temple, which is, sometimes we say it was a more permanent structure, but the tabernacle actually stood almost as long as the temple did, because the temple. So it was intended to be a more permanent structure. It was not because of their sin. It ended up being destroyed, and the tabernacle stood almost just as long as the temple did. But you're right that this will be maybe some of this will be lost. I think they were trying to observe a lot of this. Now, it wouldn't be every day as intensive as this was forever. There were certain sacrifices that would be offered every day, but it was regular. I mean, there were sacrifices offered every day even if it wasn't all of this. Okay, any other comments, thoughts? All right, so let's flip over to Numbers chapter 7. I know this is kind of jumping in the text there, but chronologically, this is kind of going on at the same time. And we can see that in chapter 7 and verse 1. And I'm just going to kind of read the first few verses. We'll talk about it briefly, but some of the specifics of this we'll talk about later. Like with the work of the Levites, there's a passage later in the chronology where we'll talk about that in more detail, but we'll note that then. On the day when Moses had finished setting up the tabernacle, that's first day, first month, year 2. Right, same day that we're starting the ordination process for the priests. And had anointed and consecrated it with all its furnishings, and anointed and consecrated the altar with all its utensils. The chiefs of Israel, you might say princes, heads of their fathers' houses, who were the chiefs of the tribes, who were over all those who were listed, approached and brought their offerings before the Lord, 6 wagons, 12 oxen, a wagon for every 2 of the chiefs, one for each, and for each one an ox. They brought them before the tabernacle. Then the Lord said to Moses, accept these from them, that they may be used in the service of the tent of meeting, and give them to the Levites, to each man according to his service. So Moses took the wagons and the oxen and gave them to the Levites. 2 wagons and 4 oxen he gave to the sons of Gershon according to their service. 4 wagons and 8 oxen he gave to the sons of Merari according to their service under the direction of Ithamar the son of Aaron the priest. But to the sons of Kohath he gave none. Lock in on that. We're going to need that in, well, a few quarters. So just you put a pin in that for a long time, and then we'll come back. We'll mention it before then. But because they were charged with the service of the holy things that had to be carried on the shoulder. They were not given any wagons because it had to be carried on the shoulder. So when somebody tries to carry it on the wagon, just say, y'all not do that. All right. And the chiefs offered offerings for the dedication of the altar on the day it was anointed, and the chiefs offered their offering before the altar. And the Lord said to Moses, they shall offer their offerings 1 chief each day for the dedication of the altar. So this is on the first day of the first month of the second year. The tabernacle has been erected. The ordination process of the priests is starting. And so the representatives of all the tribes are going to come, and they are going to bring an offering to the tabernacle. I think that each one of these things, the things they are being offered each day as they're bringing them. So the wagons are contributed just for the continual service of the tabernacle. These are going to be the wagons that they use to transport the parts of the tabernacle. But the other things that they bring in verses 12 through, 88, 89? 89. These things are going to be offered each day as they bring them. And the 12 tribes are bringing them. And so we need to read now all 88. No, I'm just kidding. Literally, what happens is it is exactly word for word repeated every time what they bring. And we have the names of the leaders of the tribes. All 12 tribes bring the exact same thing every day for 12 days. The first day of the month through the 12th day of the month, to be offered for the service in the tabernacle. Now, I just want you to think about, why is it? Generally, the writer of the book of Moses, he's pretty precise and condensed in the material that he offers. Why not just say, this is what each tribe brought times 12, right? Or that every tribe brought here's the names of the guys that brought it, and everyone brought the same thing. Why repeat it over and over and over like that?
He sums it all up in the end of the chapter anyway.
He sums it all up. Says this is what they all brought, divided out. I think that part of this is every tribe, the worship is on their behalf, and it is supported by them. And so even though just the priests are offering this, even though the Levites have the care of the temple, all the tribe, this is all of their worship. And I think this is a repetitive way to make that point. I will make this point as well. The end of number 6, Aaron gives his blessing to the people. The way the people respond is by bringing the offering to the temple. And at the very end of chapter 7, and when Moses went to the tent of meeting to speak with the Lord, he heard the voice speaking to him from above the mercy seat, that was on the ark of the testimony from between the two cherubim, and it spoke to him. God is with them. He is present with them. God blesses them through Aaron and the priest. They bring their offerings, and God is continually present with them in the tabernacle as they bring those offerings. Okay. Any questions, comments through what we've talked about tonight?
You did a good job on 7.
We covered it in short shrift.
Yes.
All right. Thank y'all very much.
Thanks for watching. If you found this video to be beneficial, please follow us on Facebook or subscribe to our YouTube channel. Feel free to share it with others that you feel like may benefit from it. If you need to contact us, please contact us via email at quinn.church@yahoo.com. Also, if you're in the area, we would love for you to come visit with us at one of our assemblies. Have a good day.